such a beautiful concept of the Father creating, um, how he created man and then placed him in the garden. And I think that's what stuck out to me the most in chapter 2, after coming to biblical cosmology, and understanding what the Bible's describing in these chapters, is that there's like a separate, he made the entirety of the plane of the earth, but then there's this special garden. And again, this is one of those details that's not included in Genesis 2. I have it in the footnotes, but Jubilees 3, 2nd Ezra chapter 3, I think, chapter 4 and chapter 6, it also talks about how the Garden of Eden was planted on the third day. And so this is why, after the first creation week, Adam and Eve can go into a separate area called the Garden of God. Now, Jubilees chapter 3 goes into great length. Chapter 3, verses 1 through 20, I believe, goes to great length to explain when Adam and Eve were created, that they had to wait for the days of their purification, according to what we know in Leviticus 12, before they could go into the garden. So it says that Adam waited 40 days and Eve waited 80 days. And so this is interesting, because that means when they get kicked out of the garden later, they had already had some sense of familiarity with life outside the garden, even if it was for a short amount of time. But that's just such an interesting paradigm that we rarely talk about in church settings.
It is, especially considering, I think what jumps off the page most to me is that Garden of Eden subject, considering the last episode of Uncommon Ground we did, where we discussed, the kingdom of the garden, because this is the first mention in our modern American canon that we have, with the beginning being Genesis, where it mentions, the Garden of Eden, and that's paradise. That's where the tree of life is planted. Revelation, Esdras, lots of places confirm that where the tree of life is planted is also the paradise that will return as the kingdom of heaven, the New Jerusalem, Mount Zion, and our inheritance, the promised land. And so it's a beautiful process to read through the scriptures and see all the descriptors that change the Garden of Eden into the paradise that's now located in the third heaven, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12.
So I just made a couple of notes for chapter 2, and it's talking about the seventh day, the weekly Sabbath was set apart and observed by the Creator. This is in the first 4 verses of chapter 2. The garden of Yahweh was deposited in the land of Eden. And Wes and I have talked about this on our broadcasts. I've talked about this in previous broadcasts, but just as a quick reminder to everyone, in the Hebrew, the word garden is a fenced off or a walled off enclosure. So this is why it's a separate concept that was planted in the region, the geographical land of Eden. And this is, but we can talk about that in future portions as far as what happened to it. Lastly, or next, I should say, Adam was placed inside the garden after the days of his purification were completed and instructed by angels on how to care for the garden. So this is interesting. In fact, it goes into greater depth in Jubilees 3 throughout the whole of the chapter to explain that the angels taught him how to set aside residue, how to do husbandry in the garden. And then when he was kicked out of the garden, it says he took those same skills and used them in the land he was created. And so they taught him how to live life, basically. And they taught him how to live life according to the Father's rules, not just some arbitrary standard. So I think that's wonderful that he's learning the Father's ways and the angelic ways, which are synonymous. He's learning this right from the beginning. So it's trying to give mankind a good head start, if you will, on how to behave so they don't face a bunch of problems. It goes on to say that Adam's wife, Eve, was created from his rib and brought into the garden after her days of purification were completed. And that is a general summary of a lot of concepts put together for Genesis 2, even though Genesis 2 in the Masoretic is quite limited in what it tells us. So I think it's beautiful. I think it's interesting that the woman is pulled from the rib, which denotes placement of someone that walks alongside you. If we want to get a little bit philosophical, it wasn't like he grabbed Adam's big toe and made a woman out of a big toe, big hammer toe, in the garden getting all dirty. And it's not like he pulled him from the crown to say that the woman would have superiority or any type of authority over the man. No, in fact, it's that they were supposed to be a helpmate. They were supposed to walk together in life and help each other. And I think that's wonderfully fitting that the rib is used.
From his side, yeah.
Yeah.
I also think it helps clarify some of the confusion, because there is a lot of confusion about the Satan character, Azazel, right? And how he was able to be there to deceive Eve and then cause Adam to sin. Whereas there's so much confusion about when did this battle take place, when Satan was kicked out of heaven. No, if you have the whole collection of scriptures available to us, you can see that the angels were sent there to the garden for a good purpose, and that Satan rebelled out of envy.